for your kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. Here are examples of the two images with which I'm going to be chiefly concerned in this talk. The standard portraits of Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth of York. I've chosen to show these two particular paintings because each of them is among the earliest examples of its kind. Most of the surviving examples of these well-known portrait types date from the late 16th century. But these paintings probably come from the first decade of the 16th century and could conceivably be contemporary with the sitters. Elizabeth died in 1503 and Henry in 1509. The Henry VII belongs to the Society of Antiquaries, and the Elizabeth of York was in the collection of the Dukes of Hamilton until it was sold at Sotheby's in 2005. Although these two examples are clearly not a pair, they weren't painted as a pair, it's equally clear that the images they represent were conceived as a pair. Sir Roy Strong, writing about these images in his Tudor and Jacobean Portraits, published in 1969, placed them at circa 1500, noting that the portrait of Henry clearly, quoting, depicted him late in life, and that the costume in the portrait of Elizabeth enabled it to be painted, again I'm quoting, towards the very last years of her life. This view has been accepted as valid ever since 1969, but I want to ask whether these images might have originated earlier in Henry's reign. After all, he come to the throne in 1485, so did he really wait for some 15 years before commissioning these images? On the question of Henry's age, he was born in 1457 and would therefore have been 43 years old in 1500. Now, as we all know, it's extremely difficult to judge the ages of sitters in Tudor portraits simply on the basis of their appearance. Henry might have been 43 here, but he might equally well have been 33, or even younger than that. And with regard to Elizabeth's costume, its most distinctive feature is the gable headdress. And this is found in monumental brasses of English ladies from circa 1490 onwards. So, in fact, neither of Strong's reasons necessarily precludes these images from having originated at an earlier date than 1500. Before I present my more thought-provoking pieces of evidence, let me also just show you this painting. It's an example of a portrait image of Henry VII's predecessor, Richard III. This particular painting, also belonging to the Society of Antiquaries, dates from the 1510s and is likely to be the earliest surviving version of this well-known portrait type. On the evidence of its carefully observed and authentic costume, it is very probably a copy of a lost original painted during Richard's reign, that is, between 1483 and 1485. And other 16th century copies of portraits of Edward IV and Henry VI suggest that by Richard's time there was something of a tradition of royal portraiture in England. And this again makes one wonder if or why Henry VII waited until circa 1500. Now I've cleared the screen so that you're not going to be unduly distracted by Richard III, as I turn now to the evidence I really want to put before you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a series of snapshots of events, together with a commentary suggesting how they might perhaps be linked. The first snapshot takes us back to July 1488. It shows us two Spanish ambassadors marvelling and the healthy appearance of a royal infant. The ambassadors were Dr. Rodrigo Gonzalva de Puebla and his colleague Juan de Sepúlveda. They were the special envoys of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic kings of Spain, and their purpose was to negotiate an alliance with England, which would in due course be sealed by the marriage of the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, and the English prince, Arthur. The child they were admiring was Arthur, aged 1 year and 10 months. De Puebla's letter to Ferdinand and Isabella describes his reaction, and I'm quoting here from a translation. "The prince appeared to us so admirable that whatever praise, commendation or flattery anyone might be capable of speaking or writing would in this case only be the truth." Now this is the important bit. As King Henry was aware of this, he wished that de Sepúlveda should take the prince's figure, image and appearance to Spain. Well, there the snapshot fades. Do we then hear anything further about the portrait of Prince Arthur being taken to Spain? The answer to that question, disappointingly, is no. My second snapshot is therefore a kind of blank, but it's important nevertheless. It shows us an English embassy setting off for Spain in December of that same year, 1488, accompanied by de Puebla and de Sepúlveda. It shows the embassy arriving at the Spanish court at Medina del Campo 3 months later, in March 1489. That's an important date to remember, by the way, March 1489. The account we have of the embassy is very full. It was written by Roger Machado, who was Richmond King of Arms. He participated in the event and he gives lots of detail about the ceremonies that occurred at Medina del Campo. In particular, there are awestruck descriptions of the lavish costumes and jewellery worn by the Spanish monarchs and their children. But Richmond King of Arms makes only the briefest references to the negotiations that took place, presumably because they happened behind closed doors, away from his gaze, and nowhere is there any mention of a portrait or a portrait painter. The third snapshot, on the other hand, is intriguing. We move forward 6 months to September 1489. Here we see Queen Isabella of Spain authorising a payment for 8 yards of Hollanda, that is fine linen canvas, to be supplied to Isabel Velázquez, maidservant of the Infanta Isabel, quoting here, to give to the English painter, al pintor inglés, for the portraits of the prince, now that's Isabella's son, Prince Juan, and the Infantas. So we have a record of an English painter being supplied with canvas on which to paint portraits of the Spanish royal children. Snapshot number 4, moving on now, takes us a little further on again, this time to February in the next year, February 1490, where we find Queen Isabella signing another warrant for payment. Master Antonio, an English painter, Maestre Antonio Pintor Inglés, was to be paid 10 Castilian doubloons for his maintenance in March of the previous year, 1489. 40 more doubloons for his maintenance from November 1489 through to February 1490, as well as smaller sums for lengths of canvas that he bought and for the gold which he'd used in certain pictures. Elsewhere in the same accounts, there are details of further payments made to the English painter, which make it clear that he was receiving, however irregularly, a monthly salary with additional payments for his materials. And since the payments to Antonio go back to that important date, March 1489, the month when the English embassy arrived at the Spanish court, it's difficult not to think that he'd come with the embassy. Incidentally, the embassy itself only stayed at the Spanish court for about a fortnight before moving on to Portugal, so clearly he didn't go on with them, he stayed behind in Spain. Well, as we saw in the third snapshot, in September 1489, the English painter was provided with canvas so that he could paint portraits of the Spanish royal children. Their ages at that time ranged from 18 years down to 3. Catherine of Aragon was still only 3 years old, though we don't know that he was required to paint them all. Presumably, in order to obtain an important commission like that, he would have needed to demonstrate that he had some competence as a portrait painter. Is it possible to suppose that his expertise might initially have been shown in a portrait of Prince Arthur? The infant Arthur was, as we saw earlier, only a year and 10 months old in July 1488. By the time the English embassy set out from London the following December, he was still only 2 years and 3 months old. Were portraits painted of such young sitters at that time? Well, the answer to that question is yes. This is the Dauphin, Charles Orleans, son of Charles VIII of France, painted by Jean Hay in a portrait which is inscribed on the original frame, and I think you can perhaps just see it at this right-hand side, with the prince's age, 26 months, and the date at the top of the frame in the middle, 1494. Well, 1494 is, of course, very close to the date we're thinking about here. And this is very much the sort of portrait one might perhaps have in mind. Well, for my final snapshot, we jump forward 10 years to 1499. On the 16th of March of that year, we find Sancho de Paredes and his wife, Isabel Bueno, stewards of Queen Isabella's chamber, receiving into the palace in Madrid a number of pictures which had been accompanying the Queen on her travels. Among them were, quoting now in translation, a further small picture which they say is of the Prince of England, and then a square box covered with leather in which there are 4 paintings on canvas. 3 of these are the King and Queen of England and their son, and the other, the Infanta Maria. Well now, at this date and in this context, the Prince of England can only have been Prince Arthur, and it looks as if Queen Isabella had 2 pictures of him. This is confirmed by a later chamber account listing the pictures that were received into the Alhambra Palace at Granada on Christmas Day in 1500. Quoting again, another small panel on which is painted the Prince of England, and another on canvas of the same person. It isn't surprising to find 2 portraits of Prince Arthur recorded in Isabella's ownership. The negotiations for his marriage to Catherine of Aragon lasted for some 12 years, during which time, of course, his appearance changed as he grew up. I've suggested elsewhere that this image of Arthur, in a portrait now at Hever Castle, may have originated at the time of the betrothal ceremony held in August 1497, when he was just short of his 11th birthday. Very possibly, one of Isabella's portraits of him may have been of this type. Of Isabella's other portrait of Arthur, it is impossible to say anything with certainty. Nor is it possible to say when she had acquired her portraits of Henry and Elizabeth. Frustratingly, there appear to be no references to pictures in any of Isabella's household documents before the ones that relate to 1499. Clearly, however, the possibility is there that the three recorded portraits on canvas of Henry, Elizabeth and Arthur arrived in Spain together and were the work of Antonio. I have one further piece of evidence that deserves consideration, and then two footnotes. Here is the further piece of evidence. It's a miniature scene, of course, showing a book being presented to Henry VII. It occurs, in fact, on folio 201 of British Library, Arundel Manuscript 66, and is contained within the initial letter of a text on astronomy. You can see that two of the figures in the miniature are pointing toward the stars of the sky. The miniature is altogether only about 10.5 centimetres high, so the faces are tiny. But even so, I think there's no doubt that we have here a recognisable likeness of Henry VII. Look particularly at the very fine arched eyebrows and the slightly beaky nose. This is a portrait, and the manuscript, made almost certainly in London, is dated 30th of June 1490. This shows that at around that time, an artist who was capable of producing portrait likenesses was working in London within the orbit of the English court. He may or may not have been Antonio, who was actually still in Spain in June 1490. He's last recorded there on the 16th of October 1490, after which, so far as I know, he vanishes from any records anywhere. Now, the first of my two footnotes is a visual one, and I apologise immediately for the really quite awful quality of these slides. The portraits are of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, painted on wooden panels. They've been in the English royal collection at least since the time of its earliest inventory, made in 1542. The likeliest explanation of their presence there is that they were sent to England at some point during the negotiations for Arthur and Catherine's marriage, most probably during the 1490s. It has been suggested that they could be Antonio's work. In connection with this, it's interesting to note that in 1486, King Ferdinand had written a letter from Salamanca to inform his sister in Naples that he wanted to send her some portraits, one of himself and another of his son, Prince Juan, but that this wasn't possible because no portrait painter could be found. Good portrait painters were evidently rare in Spain, and no doubt this is why Antonio was seized upon and persuaded to stay. As for the attribution of these paintings to Antonio, it is of course impossible to tell. It would be interesting to know more about their condition. Are those extremely red lips and rosy cheeks really original? I can't help doubting it myself. Some of you may perhaps have seen these two pictures on display last year in the Henry VIII exhibition at the British Library. It was a wonderful opportunity to look at them and assess them in the company of a whole range of other early portraits, and they really did stand out for these the extraordinary colouring of the faces, particularly the lips and the cheeks, rosy cheeks. It would also, of course, be very interesting to know more, if possible, about a date. And my second and last footnote is a documentary one. In the accounts of the Lord High Treasurer of Scotland, there's an entry dated the 19th of September 1502, recording a payment to the English painter, which brought the figures of the King, Queen, and Prince of England, and of our Queen. The words "our Queen" refer to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII, who was already by that time married by proxy to James IV of Scotland as part of an alliance between the two countries. Further entries in the treasurer's accounts reveal that, like Antonio before him, this English painter was poached by the host court in order to paint portraits. Good portrait painters were evidently in short supply in Scotland too. His name is given as Minor, and he stayed in Scotland for over a year, until November 1503, when he returned to Henry VII's service in London. In a later document, he signed his own name as Maynard Waywick, and elsewhere in the English records, he's called Maynard Waywick, Dutchman. That we heard so much about yesterday. He was, no doubt, a Netherlander, called the English painter in Scotland simply because he'd just come from England. And the same is likely to have been true, I would suggest, of Antonio. Antony, Antonis, was a common enough name in the Netherlands, and that is, after all, one of the best portrait painters.